It has been suggested that Amedeo Modigliani's artwork is expressionistic. Others say it is modern mannerism. But really, Modigliani's art is like no other and cannot be slotted into any category. He was an Italian artist at heart and began his art studies like most Italian artists, with visits to the museums in Naples, Rome, Florence and Venice. This familiarized him with classical Italian painting and sculpture, fueling his enthusiasm for the creative life of the artist. But Modigliani was also a perfect example of the tragic artist. Illness plagued him his entire life, and he loved the works of the existentialists like Nietzsche. Tragedy was Modigliani's affirmation of life, and it embraced him. Amedeo or Dado Modigliani was the youngest of 4 children born to Jewish parents, Flaminio and Eugenia. They lived in Livorno, Italy, home to a large Jewish community. Flaminio was a money changer. Shortly before his birth, the family business was struggling financially, forcing the Modiglianis to declare bankruptcy. Because of an ancient law, Amedeo, before he was even born, was able to save his family from total ruin. According to this law, creditors could not take the bed of a pregnant woman. When bailiffs came to remove Modigliani's family possessions, Eugenia suddenly went into labor with Amedeo, and so the family stacked as many of their possessions onto the bed as they could in order to prevent them being seized. Amedeo had 2 brothers and 1 sister. Their father died at a young age, leaving him and his siblings to grow up without a father figure. Eugenia's father and sister, Isaac and Laura Garson, played a fortunate and significant role in Amedeo's upbringing. The Garsons were highly educated and introduced their grandson to literature, poetry, philosophy and the visual arts at a young age. Eugenia was now the breadwinner, and due to the fact that she was educated, she was able to give English and French lessons, as well as other subjects from the family address. She taught her sickly son at home until he was 10 years old. Amedeo had several bouts with pleurisy and at 14 nearly died of typhoid fever. 2 years later he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which would slowly kill him over the next 20 years. Though he rarely spoke of his condition, he seemed aware that his time would be short. Later in life, living in Paris, he would announce to a friend, Lithuanian sculptor Jacques Lipchitz, that he sought above all une vie brève mais intense, a brief but intense life. Soon after contracting tuberculosis, he suffered another case of pleurisy. While suffering from delirium, Amadeo feverishly ranted about wanting to see the paintings in the Palazzo Pitti and the Uffizi in Florence. Eugenia promised her son that she would take him as soon as he was well again, which she did. The sickly childhood prevented the young Amadeo from receiving a traditional formal art education. However, he began drawing and painting at an early age, and his mother supported his interests. Although Eugenia preferred an academic education for her son, she later acceded to his wishes. She recounted in her diary, "On the 1st of August 1898, he begins drawing lessons, which he has wanted to do for a long time. He thinks he's already a painter." The following year, aged 14, Amadeo gave up his regular homeschooling entirely to study with his drawing teacher, Guglielmo Micheli. Amadeo often rejected the traditional rules of classical painting, but instead of disciplining his pupil, Micheli encouraged Amadeo's experimentation with different styles. After 2 years of success as a student, Amadeo became ill again, which disrupted his formal art education. After a brief stay in Florence in 1902, he continued his artistic studies in Venice, remaining there until the winter of 1906. His early admiration for Italian Renaissance painting, especially the examples he gazed upon in the beautiful city of Siena, was to last throughout his short life. In Florence, Amadeo made the acquaintance of Manuel Ortiz de Zarate, an artist who had worked alongside the Impressionists. Inspired by Zarate's descriptions of Paris and the avant-garde, Amadeo desperately wished to head there, but his mother encouraged him to stay in Florence. Restless for new opportunities, Amadeo moved to Venice and enrolled in the Scuola Libera de Nudo at the Istituto de Belle Arti, but he found it too traditional and stifling. He found great joy in creating art amid the atmosphere of the local bars and cafes, where he was introduced to illicit substances. Growing increasingly dissatisfied with the art scene in Italy, his mother finally allowed him to move to Paris in 1906. As an artist, Amadeo liked to say, quoting Nietzsche, "A man has no home in Europe save in Paris." Arriving there in 1906 at the age of 21, Amadeo emerged from his second-class train compartment wearing a smartly tailored black suit and a dramatic black cape. Though small of stature, he had a way of carrying himself which made him appear taller than his 5 feet 6 inches, and he had the airs of an aristocrat. His mother had provided him with funds to last a few months if he was careful, but Amadeo was never careful. Soon he settled in an apartment in La Bateau-Lavoir, a commune for poor struggling artists. In his worn suitcase he had packed a well-thumbed edition of Dante, whom he was prone to recite from memory at high volume day or night, and a small reproduction of Two Courtesans, a painting by the Venetian Renaissance artist Vittorio Carpaccio, which he would tack to the walls of an endless succession of rented rooms. Amadeo was described by his contemporaries as a bit reserved and almost asocial when he first arrived in Paris. He dressed as a debonair artist and he drank in moderation. Within a year his behavior had transformed from debonair artist to a debauched bohemian. Amadeo's lifestyle was raucous and reckless. He became addicted to drugs and alcohol and engaged in numerous affairs. When Louis Latourette, journalist and poet, visited Amadeo's once pristine art studio, it was a disgusting mess. He had become disillusioned with all of his bourgeois trappings, his studio becoming the object of resentment he felt towards the academic art that inspired his early career. Amadeo destroyed most of his early work. His excuse for doing this was, "Childish baubles done when I was a dirty bourgeois." Amadeo was to be seen haunting the artist hangouts of Montmartre and later Montparnasse, wearing a bright silk scarf knotted around his neck and adopting the nickname Maudit, a pun on Peintre Maudit, a cursed painter. Russian artist Chaim Soutine was a close friend, and Maurice Utrillo, later famous for his painted scenes of Montmartre, were favourite drinking companions. Amadeo was also friendly with Picasso, though they didn't socialise together. Picasso had affected a working-class look with his patched clothes and fisherman's sweaters, and very much admired Amadeo's wardrobe, actually more than his paintings. Once being unable to afford a new canvas, he painted over a Modigliani work he had been given. Amadeo, for his part, was more generous in recognizing a fellow genius, but quietly confided to a friend that artistic talent was no excuse for not dressing decently. It is speculated that Amadeo's spiral into addiction and loose living may have resulted from his tuberculosis, and knowing that this disease would eventually kill him anyway. It could well be that these intense short pleasures, numbed by alcohol and drugs, would help block out any morbid introspection. His conduct was remarked upon even in the Bohemian circles. His daughter Jeanne Modigliani notes, "Some people nearly swooned at his suave, cultivated manner, while others found him an unbearable buffoon, and a boring drunken spoilsport. He had frequent affairs and drank heavily, using absinthe and hashish. He became the personification of the tragic artist, in the same ranks as Van Gogh." Amadeo's first patron was Paul Alexandre, a young surgeon and hobby art dealer who financially supported an art colony of sorts in a crumbling house on Rue de Delta. Amadeo was allowed to paint there rent-free and in turn sold his canvases at low cost to Alexandre. Prices ranged from 10 to 20 francs each for oil paintings, and his sketches for perhaps 20 centimes. It wasn't much admittedly, but the doctor most generously let the artists retrieve their work if a better price was offered elsewhere. Between 1909 and 1913, Amadeo painted 3 oil portraits of Alexandre. The first was a conventional portrait with the subject jauntily posed with hand on hip. Another was more inspired and painted from memory, and is most distinctively Modigliani-esque, with the rapid brushwork, elongated face and blank eyes that would become his trademark. Amadeo had entered 7 watercolors in oils in Paris's Salon d'Automne exhibition in 1907, and 5 works in the Salon des Indépendants in 1908, but they attracted little attention. Apart from Alexandre, the Paris art scene patrons were not interested in his work. Embittered, he leaned in a new direction: stone carving. Romanian sculptor Constantin Brâncuș, who was a friend and neighbour, was partly responsible for this new inspiration. Amadeo was convinced Rodin and his followers had corrupted sculpture with an over-reliance on clay. Too much mud, he called it. Real sculptors, he declared, carved directly from stone. Not having Rodin's funds, he stole chunks of limestone from building sites. For the occasional sculpture in wood, he purloined oak cross ties from the new metro line, at that time being extended to Montmartre. From 1901 to 1914, Amadeo carved a series of large stone heads, but the inhalation of stone dust had considerably weakened his already frail lungs. These hewn heads had long, slender noses and tiny lips. They were massive works that combined the serenity of early Renaissance tomb sculpture with the silent eeriness of the Easter Island monoliths. In 1910, Amadeo met his first serious love, Anna Amatova. Anna had a studio in the same building as Amadeo. She was 21, several years younger than him, and was married. They began a passionate affair that lasted about a year, when she decided to return to her patient and tolerant husband. Anna personified Amadeo's ascetic ideal of perfection. It is also during this time that the subjects of his portraits began to resemble the features of his stonework. The influence of tribal art, especially African sculpture, on the avant-garde in Paris during this period cannot be overestimated, says Mason Klein, associate curator at the Jewish Museum, who believes that Modigliani's acute awareness of himself as a Jew and an outsider opened him to the richness of non-Western art. If you look at his sculpture, says Klein, you see the influence of not only African art, but Khmer art, and the art of archaic Greece, ancient Egypt and Rome. You even see some of the iconic presence of Byzantine art. Unfortunately, Amadeo's carved heads were simply too strange to attract buyers at that time. He used them as giant candle holders in the grubby studio where he often slept too. One limestone block that he had transformed into a kneeling caryatid was just too heavy for him to transport away from the vacant lot where he found and carved it. Friends fortunately rescued it shortly after his death in 1920. It is now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Impulsive and argumentative, Amadeo had neither the desire or polite restraint needed for formal portraiture. Commissioned to paint the portrait of a fox-hunting French baroness, he changed her scarlet riding jacket to canary yellow. Highly insulted, the baroness refused to pay for the painting. In 1914, Amadeo met the refreshingly eccentric English poet Beatrice Hastings. She became his mistress and often the victim of his drunken rampages. But Beatrice gave as good as she got. She could be haughty and pompous, and she was a proud feminist. Amadeo wryly nicknamed her Madame Pompadour because of her arrogance. In 1915, he painted a series of 14 portraits of Beatrice. They lived together for 2 years, but because of contrasting and clashing personalities, they decided to part ways. In that same year, Amadeo met the Polish poet and art dealer Leo Zabrowski and his wife Anna. They provided Amadeo with a studio and a supply of models for him. The following summer, Russian sculptor Zhano Orlov introduced Modigliani to Jeanne Hébuterne, a beautiful art student with a pale complexion and almond-shaped eyes. She was 19 and found the 32-year-old artist irresistible. Jeanne was from a very conservative bourgeois background. Her staunch Roman Catholic family intensely disapproved of Modigliani, whom they perceived to be little more than an immoral vagrant, and his being Jewish certainly didn't sit well with them. Regardless of her parents' frowns, Jeanne and Amadeo soon moved in together. Their relationship was tumultuous to say the least, and their very public arguments became more famous than his solitary drink-fueled antics. Despite their clashes, Amadeo always introduced Jeanne as his best beloved, an endearment he never used with the other women in his life. Apparently, Jeanne's love for Amadeo was unconditional, because she stated she didn't mind his drunken carousing. Amadeo could never escape poverty. He was evicted from a series of rooms in Montmartre and Montparnasse, and slept in 1 franc a night hotels, train station waiting rooms, and even abandoned buildings. He managed, however, to maintain a faded elegance, and unlike his fellow impoverished artist friends, he refused to work odd jobs, though his efforts to sell his own work often ended in disappointment. Writing in 1925, painter Maurice de Vlaminck recalled Amadeo showing some of his drawings to a wily dealer who had tracked him down in his studio. When the dealer haggled for a discount, Amadeo, without a word, picked up the entire pile of drawings, straightened them carefully, then made a large hole through them. Through this hole he threaded an old piece of string, and then left the slack-jawed dealer in the room, while he went and hung them in the lavatory as toilet paper. Aside from small sums that his mother occasionally mailed him from home, Amadeo survived mainly on quick sketches of people in cafes that he traded for coins, a meal or a drink. Vlaminck remembered Modigliani's casual dignity as he worked the Café de la Rotonde. With the gesture of a millionaire, he would hold out the sheet of paper, on which he sometimes but rarely signed his name, as he might have held out a banknote in payment to someone who had just bought him a glass of whiskey. In 1918, with Paris under German bombardment, Jeanne pregnant, and Amadeo's always fragile health worsening, Zabrowski organized an artistic retreat in Provence for himself, his family, and a group of artists, including Amadeo and Jeanne, that lasted nearly a year. There, with the warm and welcoming light, Amadeo's palette grew lighter and his compositions bolder. Jeanne gave birth to their daughter Jeanne in Nice on November the 29th, 1918. By the summer of 1919, she was pregnant again. "I'm getting fat and becoming a respectable citizen of Cagnes-sur-Mer," Amadeo told an artist friend that summer in mock horror. "I'm going to have 2 kids. It's unbelievable. It's sickening." Amadeo sold only a small number of his works during his lifetime, and never received much money for any of them. The money he did receive was consumed quickly by his drug habit. It is said that a landlord confiscated Amadeo's canvases for unpaid rent and used them to patch mattresses. In May 1919, Modigliani returned to Paris with Jeanne and their baby daughter. They rented an apartment in the Rue de la Grande Chaumière. Here, Amadeo and Jeanne's love intensified and they painted endearing portraits of each other. In 1920, Amadeo made this entry in his sketchbook: "A new year, here begins a new life." This was written just 3 weeks before his death. A worried neighbor came to check on them one day and found a delirious Amadeo holding desperately onto Jeanne, who was almost 9 months pregnant. He was taken to the charity hospital where he died 2 days later, on January the 24th, 1920, of tubercular meningitis. Amadeo Modigliani's funeral was attended by many of his colleagues from the artistic community in Montmartre and Montparnasse. He was buried in the Père Lachaise cemetery. All of a sudden, previously reticent art dealers were now eager to buy the dead artist's paintings, and approached the mourners inquiring if they had any to sell. The price of his paintings skyrocketed, and forgeries suddenly flooded the market. Jeanne was taken to her family's home, but was inconsolable. 2 days later, she threw herself out of the 5th-story window, killing herself and her unborn child. Because Jeanne's family blamed Amadeo for her death, they refused to allow her body to be placed next to his. 10 years later, they had a change of heart and reburied her beside him. Amadeo's mother and siblings in Italy never benefited from his posthumous success. They owned few, if any, of his paintings. Their surviving child, Jeanne's only inheritance, was a collection taken up on her behalf by her father's fellow artists. Amadeo's sister Margherita, who lived in Florence, adopted their orphaned daughter. Well, my dear friends, I do hope you enjoyed that presentation. What a sad story, actually. Always a bit sad for artists who hardly make a few pfennigs during their life, and then come the art dealers waiting to pounce after their death to try and cash in, which happens quite a lot. all during the making of this, I kept wondering about the landlord who sewed his canvases to repair the mattresses. I kept thinking, where are they now? But of course it's ridiculous. They are long ago thrown on the dust heap or incinerated. I doubt very much that they have survived, but it always sort of intrigues you when you read exactly what is on the screen there, that his paintings were going for less than $10 at that time. Yes, and look at that. An anonymous bidder at Sotheby's auction house paid $31.3 million for Jean Hébutein's portrait. I mean, wow. What a difference. What a difference. I can imagine that dealer's face when Modigliani just poked a big stick through them. My father remembered a similar incident where an antique dealer went to visit a friend of his. My father was present, and my father's friend was a huge guy, and the dealer was trying to haggle the price under for a painting that my father's friend owned. And then my father's friend just looked at this dealer, picked the painting up and put his fist through it, then stamped on it, or sort of smashed it with his feet into many pieces. Not something I'd recommend doing to a valuable painting, but I can imagine that people get very annoyed with these dealers who are trying to make huge profits and pay very little. When I was in my 20s, and I was very interested in art and studying it and practicing it, creating it, I couldn't appreciate Modigliani's art at that time. I was very much into realism and the sort of academic style of painting. But in the last about 10 years, I have really come to appreciate his art, so much so that he is one of my favorite artists now. One of them, I have quite a few, but I really do love his work. So that is why I still hope one day that one of these paintings will wend its way to me. I'm sending out the vibrations there, the energy to the universe, to bring one of these paintings, to detach it from that ancient mattress wherever it is residing, and find its way to me. Oh my dear. I found a few interesting little side stories while researching this, which I'm going to share with you now, my dear viewers. Check these out. Quite interesting. So I found a couple of interesting side stories before I wind this up. This is a site, what's it called, the site? artandantiquesmag.com. Modigliani finds a dealer. I will include the link. If I forget, just remind me, I'll add it afterwards. I'm very forgetful of such things. But this was quite fascinating. Apparently, and I won't read all of it, you can read it at your leisure, but he was quite, down and out, Modigliani. He was often going quite hungry, and so he became acquainted with Rosalie Tobia, who owned a tiny restaurant called Chez Rosalie on the Rue Campagne Première. You have to read through this. She had actually been a beautiful model in her time, and I did find an image, and I will try and find it again. She posed for a lot of the well-known artists and had many lovers. At that stage, it was impossible to imagine, since she was completely shapeless with sagging breasts. Am I allowed to say that, YouTube, when it eventually gets there? Or are you going to demonetize me for that? I hope not. And some sort of net or Neapolitan kerchief covering her stringy hair. But it's quite fascinating because she was so motherly to these artists, and she would feed them free. If they couldn't afford to eat, she would make big, huge pans of spaghetti bolognese and cheap wine and leftovers. Those who could pay did, those who could not ate anyway. What a wonderful, saintly woman. Never knew about her. I did find some images, which I will show you. I found some images of her. Let's have a look. You have to read this. It touches your heart. So, they often paid her with drawings or paintings. Rosalie complaining the whole time that she had too many already. The legend, probably true, is that she kept them covered with grease in a kitchen cupboard, and the rats gnawed away at them, and when she thought of cashing them in, it was too late. Oh, she probably had a whole lot. Apparently, Yeah, Modigliani once painted a fresco on one of her walls. Rosalie was so disgusted that next day she made Luigi cover it up with white paint. You have to read it. It's fantastic. I won't go on with it too long, otherwise some of the viewers might be a bit annoyed. But another, let's have a quick look. So there's Rosalie there. I found an image of her in her little cafe. Can we find another image? That's her standing out. Cher Rosalie. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And there she is serving some of the artists in her little cafe. I wonder what building is there now. Absolutely fascinating. If I found another one here, there she is, making coffee, I guess. Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And there is the lady herself. The saint of artists. What a wonderful woman. One more photo there. That's of her having a well-deserved cuppa after feeding those artists. This was about Leopold Zabrowski, the art dealer. It's also quite tragic. As Modigliani's art dealer, Zabrowski accumulated a small fortune which he lost during the Great Depression of the 1930s, ultimately dying poor in Paris in 1932. His widow was forced to sell his whole collection, which is now completely dispersed. Oh my goodness, when fate deals you a bad hand, he certainly did have that bad hand. This story I absolutely love. I love it, and I do remember hearing about it at the time. We didn't have the internet back then. It was in 1984. I laughed my socks off at these pretentious dealers who were absolutely convinced that these heads that they found in the canal near Modigliani's birthplace in Livorno declared they were genuine. They were definitely from Modigliani, and even after the students came forward saying they had made the heads themselves and threw them in the canal, these experts couldn't go back on what they said. They would be disgraced. So they kept saying it definitely isn't. These people were just trying to get attention, these students, until the students came up with videotapes showing how they made them. And they provided photographic evidence of their work. Oh my goodness, I love it. I love stories like that. You know, if you're an honourable dealer, don't be insulted, but some of them are real rats, real sharks, and I love to hear tales like that. And what else did I find? Again, remind me if I forget to put the links up, do remind me. This one here is from Youppi.com, just about the daughter. She was an artist in her own right. I didn't realise that until researching this case. And she died. When did she die? What year was that? 1984, I guess. Yeah, she died suffering a cerebral hemorrhage in a fall. She was 66. I think that's right. I think I read that she had actually died before she found out that the heads that were thrown in the canal were a hoax. She probably thought they were. Yeah, here we go. Yeah. She thought they were. Sorry about that, Jean, but good on those students for fooling the art world. Why not? Yeah, and I think that's about it. My dear friends. And actually, I think the heads, those fake heads, are actually still on display. So they must have done a good job. They obviously read the story that Modigliani, in his rage, would smash up his sculptures and throw them in the canal. So they've they executed a brilliant scam there. Before I sign off, I have a blooper for you. I love French history. I love especially stories about artists in Paris, late 1800s, early 1920s, and even in earlier periods of French history, and of course the wonderful eccentric tales that often come out of France. But French, I don't speak French. I have to learn one day. I must. It's a beautiful language, and I really feel ashamed about murdering it each time. I have to look on the web to hear how it's pronounced, and here's one of them where I was having great difficulty, but I'm quite willing to share that with you, my dear friends. One day I will learn. Hopefully I get the time to learn some French. Maybe when I retire I'll have more time. Here we go. Here's the blooper, and I'll sign off before that. Take care. God bless. Und bis nächstes Mal. Until next time, my dear friends. Bye-bye. and 5 works in the Salon des
Salon des Indépendants.
and 5 works in the Salon des Indépendants.
Salon des Indépendants.
And 5 works in the Salon des Indépendants. Underpants.